There you are, Daniel. Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. And Daniel, just before you kick off your presentation, I just want to give a brief introduction. For everybody listening, Daniel has worked in neurodiversity in a workplace context for over 15 years. He spent much of his career with the National Autistic Society's employment team, and he also has considerable practical experience of neurodiversity through supporting medical and healthcare students while as a disability advisor, at St. George's University. And in 2016, Daniel founded Adjust to raise awareness of neurodiversity in the workplace by providing organizations with clear, positive, and practical training and consultancy. And since setting up Adjust, he's worked with many high-profile employers, including CIPD, Ernst & Young, HS2, TK Maxx, and the Bank of England. And Daniel is going to be presenting to us this morning on, I suppose, the neurodiversity paradigm. And why is neurodiversity a workplace asset rather than an obstacle? So, Daniel, you are very welcome. The floor is yours for the next 30 minutes.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my living room. My name's Daniel Aherne. I've founded an organisation called Adjust, as you just heard from Aidan. I always like to tell people how I sort of got into what I do. And when I was younger, originally I wanted to be a social worker. And I spoke to a social worker and said, how can I get into social work? And she said, do some volunteering to build up your skills. This was 20 years ago now. I was about 16, 17 at the time. And I said, oh, volunteering, no, thank you, not for me. It sounds like working for free. But then a couple of weeks later, I went into college and there was a notice board at college that said, it was an opportunities notice board. And one of the opportunities was come and volunteer with our autistic son on a play scheme. And I went and did that because a social worker had said it. And then I never looked back. I got so interested in autism. That's what I did. I never became a social worker. John Lennon said, life's what happens to you whilst you're busy making other plans. And that's what happened to me. And I just got so interested in this world that, 20 years later, I'm still in it. And as Aidan said, I set up Adjust in 2016 to provide employers with a clear and practical understanding of neurodiversity. And at Adjust, we focus on autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD. And we really aim to start the conversation around neurodiversity in every workplace. That's my aim for this year, to start the neurodiversity conversation in every workplace. So doing sessions like this today is part of that aim. At Adjust, we deliver training, we do assessments, coaching, consultancy. We've worked with such an array of employers, and actually, I think this is one of my favourite things about neurodiversity, in that I haven't just worked with one company, with one set of people for 20 years. I've worked with such a range of organisations. So you can see there, since we set up Adjust, I've worked with the Met Office, Next, Vodafone, Channel 4, EY. And as Ada mentioned, I used to work at the National Autistic Society. And when I was at the National Autistic Society, I worked with Battersea Dogs Home. I also worked with Man United. It's such a range. And I think if one thing can sum up neurodiversity quite beautifully, I think it's the array of companies that you'll hear that we've all worked with today. So the aims of today's session is to give you an understanding of neurodiversity as an innate way of thinking rather than a medical issue. We're going to examine different types of neurodivergence and think about the competitive advantage of neurodiversity in the workplace. So at Adjust, we define neurodiversity in this way. So we define neurodiversity as the concept that we recognise, value and celebrate that we all think differently. And as Aidan mentioned, the term was first coined by someone called Judy Singer back in 1998. So this word, neurodiversity, has been around now for about 22 years. So it's been around for a long time, but I think it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that workplaces are starting to embrace the term and really celebrate neurodiversity. I often talk about neurodiversity as a celebration of individuality, and when Judy Singer came up with the term, she compared it to things like biodiversity. So in biodiversity, you've got the understanding that different animals and different plants will thrive in different environments. And a couple of years ago now, I went on an amazing walking holiday in Utah, and I saw, you might be wondering where I'm going with this, and I saw loads of amazing cactuses, or is it cacti? I saw loads of cactuses or cacti in the desert, and these cactuses, the flowers were blooming, they were really tall, they were having a really nice time, they were a very happy cactus. If we moved that cactus to our back gardens in London, like today it's really raining, those cactuses wouldn't survive, they wouldn't thrive. But we wouldn't say that cactus was disordered. We wouldn't say there's something wrong with this cactus. We wouldn't say we need to go and shun that cactus. We would just understand that a cactus really thrives in the right environment with the right amount of sun and just the right amount of rain. So I'm going to keep coming back to that point as we go through today and thinking about how we can adjust our environment to help people meet their potential. As the terms evolved over the years, it's become an umbrella term for a set of differing neurotypes or skills profiles, as I call them. And in the workplace, this has become sort of an umbrella term where we're now recognizing these differences. So neurotypes can include, but it's not limited to, things like autism, Asperger's syndrome, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, Tourette's, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, epilepsy. So it's really, really wide. At Adjust, we just focus on four neurotypes that we focus on, or dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, and autism. And just a point on autism, today when I talk about autism, I use the term autism or autistic. As Aidan's already alluded to, there's lots of different language that people will use and people identity. So I use autism or autistic because the majority of the autism community prefer those terms. Obviously, I've met other people who prefer Asperger's syndrome, etc., but I'll use autism or autistic. And it really early on in my career, I said to an autistic person, "What would you like to be called?" And I meant the label. What label would you like to use? And I said, "What would you like to be called?" And he said, "Lee." And that really reminded me that I'm working with individuals and not to get too hung up on different labels. I love this quote from neurodiversity advocate John Elder Robinson. To me, neurodiversity is the idea that neurological differences like autism and ADHD are the result of the normal natural variation in the human genome. So we actually need this difference as a human species to survive and thrive. We need people that think differently, and people who have autism or ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, think differently. And I often think that anybody who achieved anything astonishing throughout history would have probably been neurodiverse in some way. And I heard a lovely quote the other day, which was, you might have heard that nonsense about the MMR jab causing autism. The doctor who came up with that was actually thrown out of the General Medical Council. But I heard a lovely quote the other day, which was vaccines don't cause autism, autism causes vaccines. And the idea of that quote is that there might be a lot of autistic scientists working on things like vaccines. And it would not surprise me if there were very neurodiverse teams that came up with the different vaccines that exist at the moment for COVID-19. So we really need people that think differently in order to survive and thrive as a species. One thing I noticed throughout my career, and this is why I love the term neurodiversity, is there's been a massive overlap between a lot of the neurotypes that we focus on. So when I was at the National Autistic Society, so many people I worked with were obviously autistic to access the service, but they also had ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia. And sometimes in the service we worked in, because we were really aware of this overlap, if someone had a diagnosis of dyspraxia, we still might work with them and understanding that actually it can be quite hard to gain a diagnosis of autism. We didn't ever want that to be a barrier. But this is why I really love this term neurodiversity. And interestingly, I've only heard it first myself back in 2008. I've got epilepsy myself, and I remember speaking to one of my autistic colleagues at the National Autistic Society, and he had asked me why I'd been off one day. I haven't come in, and I said, "Oh, I've got epilepsy. I need a sort of day to recover from." from having a fit. And he said, oh, that makes you neurodiverse. And I really loved that term back then in 2008. And that's when I first heard it, and it first sort of inspired me a bit more, because so many people that I'd worked with don't fit into the neat label box of just ADHD or just dyslexia or just autism. And I really love thinking about this term of neurodiversity or neurotypes or neurodifferences. It's really thinking that actually a certain percentage of the population just think differently to everyone else. And on that note, about 15% of your workforce is estimated to be neurodivergent. So that's a great chunk of your workforce. And actually, I think it could be even higher than this. And also, if you think about people that have a connection to neurodiversity. So whenever I go into a workplace to do a talk, I would say about 20% of the people that are on the call or turn up to the session probably have a child who's neurodiverse in some way or a connection to neurodiversity. So I would estimate how many people that could be connected and affected by neurodiversity. It wouldn't surprise me if it was even a quarter of your workforce. However, only one in 10 of HR professionals through a CIPD survey consider neurodiversity in their people management practices. So there's two things about this. One part of me feels, quite depressed that at the moment only 1 in 10 HR professionals consider neurodiversity in their people management practices, because for some of us, you'll hear some of us speak today, we've been involved in this area for a long, long time. And this study was done in 2018. So on one hand, I'm a bit like, oh, that's quite low. But on the other hand, I think it's so exciting to be part of something that's really right at the beginning. And I think a lot of organizations I work with are only just starting their neurodiversity conversation. So it's quite a privilege to be part of that. And I love the idea of shaping. I love working with organizations that haven't got a policy in place or procedure at the moment, and shaping that right from the start. That's just something that particularly interests me. And so now we're going to have a poll. We're going to have a poll on dyslexia. So I believe someone's going to put that poll up on screen for us. It's moving all the time. It's like an election result night. And about 40% of you have gone with 10 to 15%. So if I go back to my slides now, the answer is actually 10 to 15%. So 10 to 15% of the UK population have dyslexia. I think it's excellent that a lot of you thought it was a lot more than that. I actually think it probably is a lot more than that, but this is the current estimate. And I often say, don't think that even 10% is such a small number, because if the UK population is 80 million, 10% of that is 8 million. And that's the population size of London. And if you live and work in London, I'd get you to think about everyone you see having dyslexia on your daily commute. Has everyone got dyslexia? If everybody in London had dyslexia, I think dyslexia would be more worldwide renowned and celebrated and understood. So think that 8 million at a minimum, it's not a small number. Thank you for taking part in that poll. I've got another bit of interaction here. Which person with dyslexia said, at school I struggled, I didn't understand it then, but I was and still am severely dyslexic. I knew I was smart, but nobody else could see it. It's my different way of thinking that has been the key to my success. And the clue is a fragrant entrepreneur. So if anybody just wants to type their answer in the chat box, and as soon as I see the right answer, I will just carry on, and I'll let you know. So anyone want to write down who that might be? Joe Malone, someone straight in there with Joe Malone. It is Joe Malone. Joe Malone's dyslexic, and I think this quote really sums up how I think about neurodiversity. And you think about that cactus I was talking about, happy in Utah, not as happy in our back gardens in London. And actually, when she was in school, she struggled because we measure a lot of dyslexic people's ability in school through reading and writing. But in the world, when she went into the world of work, she set up her own business, and having that different way of thinking. So a lot of people with neurodiverse profiles think differently. That's been the key to her success. It's also interesting, if you listen to her Desert Island Disc, she talks about having a heightened sense of smell. And actually, a lot of the neurotypes I focus on have sensory sensitivities to things like smell, touch, light, taste, or noise. And actually, for Jo Malone, her heightened sense of smell and a different way of thinking is why she's been able to sell us all £600 candles and no one's noticed. So she's been really successful. So here's a profile of dyslexia. I run sessions on dyslexia where we talk about it all day, so it's very hard to get it all into you know, a half-an-hour presentation, but just focusing on some of the strengths here. A lot of dyslexic people I've worked with have great verbal skills, great verbal ability, really good at problem solving, really good at coming up with ideas. A lot of dyslexic people have very 3D thinking, very visual, really good at working with people. It was really interesting when I worked here as a disability advisor in a medical school. I'd see different clusters of neurodiverse profiles in different jobs. So loads of the physiotherapists had dyslexia, and I couldn't think of a profile that would suit them more because they're working with people all the time, problem solving. Dyslexic people can be very holistic thinkers. You go to see a doctor and say you've got a bad foot, they'll fix your foot. You go to see a physiotherapist and say you've got a bad foot, they might say, well, it's your gait, or it's the way you run, or it's the way you stand, you need to increase your core strength. You know, they think very holistically and outside the box. So what I love to talk about is the strengths, but there are the challenges, and we don't always have time to go into them throughout today. But one of the things that we like to achieve, I think, when we celebrate neurodiversity is just focus on some of those strengths that don't often get talked about. And one last thing about dyslexia, a lot of you often just assume that dyslexia is just this, that words and sentences move around. But actually, for a lot of dyslexic people and a lot of neurodiverse profiles, they can have visual stress from bright white backgrounds and black writing. So if I could get you all today, after today, you're going to be taking a lot of information. Just to change one thing, it'd be try to change anything where you have a bright white background and black writing on it. So that's perhaps one takeaway you could take from today. We do need to zoom through this. So we're going to have a look at autism next. So I've got another poll coming up around the statistics on autism. People in the UK are autistic, 1 to 2%, 10 to 12%, 16 to 18%, or 100%. So I'll give you a few moments to vote on that. Great, I'm going to move on from there. So about 45% of you said between 10 to 12%, and 23%, 1 to 2%. Okay, what we're going to do is go back to my slides now and have a look at what the National Autistic Society estimate this to be at the moment. And at the moment, this is estimated by the National Autistic Society as 1.1%. Like many of you that voted in the poll, I think it's much higher than this. And many reasons, anybody I think that's underrepresented in society is underrepresented in any diagnostic stats, but particularly autism. So there's no reason why the gender balance shouldn't be the same, but at the moment, males are 4 times more likely to have a diagnosis of autism than women. So there's many reasons for this. I could do a whole session for an hour on just this point, but a lot of the original research done around autism was very male orientated. A lot of the research participants were male, and then that sort of self-perpetuates. And actually, a lot of women I used to work with when I was at the National Autistic Society said when they were younger, they would mask their autism, so they would keep it in. They wouldn't be their authentic self. And also they would mirror the behavior of others. And actually, I've just written a blog with a woman who's autistic and has Tourette's, and she says that women only get diagnosed once they're in crisis, and we need to avoid that. We need to be getting to the point where people are diagnosed before crisis. But I could talk about this stat for a lot longer, but I do need to move on today. So we've got another Guess Who. Which autistic person said, "It makes me different, and being different is a gift. It also makes me see things from outside the box. I don't easily fall for lies. I can see through things." And the clue is a climate activist. Does anybody want to have a guess who that might be? You can just put it in the chat box there. Yeah, Greta. So Greta Thunberg is autistic, and there's a great documentary on the BBC iPlayer at the moment called I Am Greta. And one of the things I've often loved about working with autistic people is the sort of honesty and sense of justice. And you can see that very strongly in Greta Thunberg. And actually, it's great that we've got a young woman who's autistic and has ADHD featured so prominently in the media. And the documentary is great. I'd really advise that you watch it. And she goes to a climate change conference, and she says to her dad, like, "I cannot believe the amount of people that are eating meat and dairy here." And I find that really funny that actually it's a lot of the time autistic people can pick up on these sort of hypocrisies that we all do And I've always found that really interesting when I worked with autistic people. So Greta Thunberg, great example of an autistic person. Some autistic people I've worked with have what we might describe as a spiky profile of ability. So I've worked with a lot of autistic people whose strengths are really, really high in things like problem solving and eye for detail. And actually, eye for detail doesn't always mean that all autistic people are just going to go into computing jobs. I worked with a makeup artist who did, I don't know the right word, makeup artistry for Kate Moss and Lily Cole and stuff like that. That's how her eye for detail manifested. Here's some other stuff about an autism profile. So a lot of autistic people I've worked with over the years, very logical in their approach to work, very dedicated, very good problem solvers. A lot of autistic people I worked with would go into a job and stay there for a very long time. Areas that we need to be looking at when we're training up managers is some of the difficulties that might exist around sensory stuff. So a lot of autistic people have said to me, they can hear like the electricity in the walls. And actually one thing that autistic people have often said to me again and again is it's not so much the electricity in the walls, well, that will bother them. It's actually sometimes not people not believing them. So the rest of the workforce can't hear the electricity in the walls. So everyone else says, oh no, that's not a problem. So one thing I'd say to you is if an autistic employee tells you that they find something difficult, you know, take them on face value about that. We've got another poll. Now we're going to be looking at the prevalence of dyspraxia. It's estimated in the UK at the moment. So we've got, is it 12%, 50%, 5% or 1%? Okay, so we've got the majority of people saying 5%. If we go back to my slides, I can reveal the answer there. It's 5%, so well done. So it's estimated that 5% of the population have dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is commonly known as a neurotype that affects gross motor skills or fine motor skills, which means riding a bike or catching a ball. That's a sort of more gross motor skill. And fine motor skills, these things that involve really small movement, like doing up your shoelaces or a tie or doing up your buttons. But actually, as with all these profiles I focus on, I think there's something else. Excuse me, I think there's something else that's often missed around dyspraxia, and that is that a lot of people with dyspraxia can be excellent communicators, and I've got an excellent example to show you. So, which person with dyspraxia said, I sometimes think, why oh why hasn't Velcro taken off? And the clue is Wizard Boy. So if anyone wants to have a guess who that could be. Daniel Radcliffe, yes. So Daniel Radcliffe has dyspraxia and he wishes Velcro had taken off and was more fashionable because he struggles to do up his shoelaces, because he struggles with that fine motor skills. But actually he spent his whole career using his verbal ability and his communication skills. So I really like to highlight some of these strengths. A lot of dyspraxic people have, again, we talk about this profile of spiky profiles can be really, really good in some areas and might need support in others. So a lot of dyspraxic people, very creative, very good with people. And one thing I haven't really mentioned so far is that actually a lot of dyspraxic people, a lot of neurodiverse people, a lot of these neurotypes I focus on, sometimes high anxiety can be an issue and low self-esteem, because throughout life we have only ever focused on what people can't do and we hardly ever focus on what they can do. One of my friend's children's got dyslexia and dyspraxia, and before Christmas last year, or the year before that now, his mum was sat down with him to write Christmas cards out, and he was really struggling with the handwriting and the spelling. That probably took about half an hour to 40 minutes of like tears and frustration. And later on in the afternoon, where his mum had sellotaped Christmas decorations up to the wall, because the flat was getting hot, the sellotape was like not working and unpeeling. And this little boy said, we should invent super glue sellotape. And his mum just said, oh, whatever. And, you know, I'm not criticizing parents. It's just, that's a really good story to show. We put half an hour to 40 minutes into the negative. Someone invents a brand new product and we just say, oh, whatever. And we really need the next generation coming through, and the people that you support in the workplace. We really need to be celebrating strengths, because to be defined by something you can't do, it must really affect your self-esteem and confidence, and then that's going to affect workplace performance. So the last poll of today, we're going to look at how many people are estimated to have ADHD in the UK. So we've got the majority of you here are looking at about, it's changing all the time, but we've got about a split between about 5% and 15%. So if we go back to my slides, we'll have a look at that there. We'll have a look at the answer. Oh, I've got to share them. So used to everything being automated these days. So at the moment, it's estimated that 5% of the UK population have ADHD, which stands for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which is what Aidan talked about at the beginning. And within ADHD, you've also got the inattentive type, which means without the hyperactive element, so ADD. So ADD can manifest, I often say when I'm training, it's like those of you that have been listening, look like you've been listening to me talking, but thinking about your dinner, or those of you that when you read a book, you read 10 pages, but none of it's actually gone in. So, and again, like autism, many women and underrepresented groups are underrepresented in these diagnostic stats. I've got my last guess who for you of the day. Well, I don't know if anyone else is going to do them. My last guess who. Which person with ADHD said, focus like a laser, not a flashlight? And the clue is, and this is my session, so this is the truth. This is the truth. The greatest basketball player of all time. Anybody want to have a guess who that could be? Michael Jordan. Someone straight in there with that. And one thing I like to highlight about Michael Jordan, he says, focus like a laser, not a flashlight. And this is because actually ADHD is so associated with a lack of concentration that people actually don't always understand that ADHD, people can really hyper focus, really laser focus. And Michael Jordan struggled in the education system, but obviously went on to be one of the world's greatest sportsmen by focusing like a laser. A lot of ADHD people that I've met have a sort of profile similar to this. They can be very passionate about what they believe in, very creative, great speakers, very outcome focused. When I worked at the medical school, loads of the paramedics had ADHD. You know, I said there's neurodiverse profiles. So loads of the paramedics had ADHD, and it really suited them actually because they could really hyper focus on incidents that happened. They were really fast at processing what was going on. And actually, I said to one of them once, isn't the best thing about your job, you just get to sit around all day waiting for something to happen? And they said, no, not at all. Because for a lot of people with ADHD, boredom is their kryptonite. Boredom is the thing they find hardest. So actually, a lot of the paramedics liked being on the go. And some of you might recognize this in yourself or people you know. A lot of people with ADHD like to keep busy and keep going all the time, because when it gets to boredom, that's when the difficulties can often happen. And obviously, again, there we've got some of the challenges, and you'll all get these slides after today, but I really like to highlight some of the strengths as a sort of foundation for the conference today. So why is this all important to you as employers? I think it can give you a competitive advantage. If you've got people that think differently, you're going to have a competitive advantage over your competitors. It can solve skill set shortage problems. So I've done some work with organizations like EY, where we recruited neurodiverse people to certain roles that they were struggling to fill. If you understand neurodiversity, it's going to improve your recruitment. If you understand some autistic people might struggle in an interview, some dyslexic people might not be able to represent themselves best with a written application form, you can make those changes. If you understand your workforce, you're going to save on recruiting replacements. You're going to be able to develop your workforce. You're going to have an increased skill set. It's good for employee engagement. Whenever I do these sessions, I think there's 60 of you on here today. Like I said, it would not surprise me if about 10 to 12 of you had a personal connection. And this is when I've done sessions in workplaces, is what makes people come along. And a lot of people these days are choosing where to spend their money, where to work, based on employer values. So embracing something like neurodiversity is good for employer branding. And you see organizations like GCHQ really embrace neurodiversity, and they highlight that a lot in their sort of PR and media that you see on socials. So my last slide today, before I take any questions, is how do we get the neurodiversity conversation started in the workplace, and what does that look like? And I think we need to be training recruitment teams, giving them awareness around this. So I've done that with Vodafone, I've done that with EY recently. We need to be training up managers. So I've done a whole, over the last year, we did a whole set of training with the Met Office. We trained a lot of their managers. We trained over 200 people at the Met Office. And now the management neurodiversity module is part of their management development program. We need to look at support for employees. What pathways of support exist for employees in your workplace? Do you have staff networks? I'm very passionate about colleagues having this awareness. So actually a lot of budgets often go to recruitment teams and managers and HR, but colleagues need to know about this, because if you're autistic, you spend your day with colleagues. It's very good for them to understand about neurotypes and people thinking differently. And lastly, it's a very small sentence, but it's the biggest piece of work for you all, looking at your workplace policies, environment, and culture. And so thank you for listening to me. I tried to squeeze as much as I can into that time. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Really enjoyed the presentation, and it's great to bring to life more information about the different neurodifferences. There's one question here. Someone has asked, do you think neurodiversity should be more clearly recognized in the Equality Act? And our next speaker is actually speaking on the legal perspective, but I'd love to know your view on this from kind of the neurodiversity paradigm, because some people talk about neurodiversity and they talk about disability, because, you know, neurodiversity is covered as a hidden disability under the Equality Act. And yet many other people don't see neurodiversity as a disability. How have you kind of navigated that journey with organizations where you're trying to celebrate strengths while also acknowledge the investment that needs to be made in mitigating for challenges as well?
I think it can, good question. I think it can depend on the environment. So like the cactus in the desert thrives, move it to our back garden, it doesn't. I worked with an autistic person who was a military map reader. When he was in that role, he wasn't considered to have a disability. There was no barrier for him in the workplace. He was so good at his job. Guess what happened? He got promoted to management. And as a manager, the barrier that came in for him was the communication. And then he would be covered under the Equality Act and then needs support. So it will really depend on the environment and how somebody's thriving in their job with what support they've got and what that job looks like. So I think all the neurotypes I talk about are recognised under the Equality Act at the moment. But yeah, so it will depend on the environment for somebody and what barriers exist in their workplace.
Okay. Another question that somebody sent to me privately was just if an organization is approaching, say, a neurodiversity strategy, is it better to talk about neurodiversity as a whole, or is it better to have almost sub-strategies for, say, dyslexia, autism, ADHD, etc.?
I think to start the conversation, start with neurodiversity as a whole. This is just my advice. I'm just one person. I think start with that as a whole, because so many adjustments we can put in place, especially around recruitment, could be beneficial for autistic people, dyslexic people, people with ADHD, epilepsy, etc. So I think actually looking at it as a whole is a better strategic way to go. And then maybe as your conversation evolves over the years, then you could start to break it down into smaller sections.
Great, thank you. Here's a good question. What is the best way to find out how neurodiverse your existing workforce is?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of organizations have invested in things like screening. So a lot of the organizations that you're here today, and we do it as well, we offer screening to employers so people can screen. One thing I would say is if you want to screen your employees, don't screen someone unless you've got a procedure in place to put something supportive in place for that. So if you screen your workforce and find out you've got 100 dyslexic employees, that's fantastic, but then what are you going to do about that? So I think the best way to do it is screening, but I would make sure before you do the screening that you have pathways of support in place and that you really understand what they're going to look like.
Mm-hmm. Great. And another question here is kind of when we talk about education, what do you think, schools, higher education could do differently? I mean, I know we're talking about the workplace today, but it is an education question. So I know we have some higher ed and some education providers in today. So what's the perspective on education?
So I worked as a disability advisor in higher education at a medical school, and universities have a lot of fantastic support in place because there's a lot of good funding. A lot of it comes down to funding. The politest thing I can say about schools, and I've got to be polite, is perhaps the funding isn't always in place. I specifically set up a Just to focus on the workplace so I could maintain my professionalism. I think I might find it quite difficult working in schools. And actually, I don't have the background as a teacher, and I don't always understand the intricacies and difficulties they may have. But yeah, I personally just think raising awareness of it and teaching other children about it as well. So doing sort of sessions like I've done today, you could really translate that into education piece for children as well. So just more education, more awareness around it. But yeah, it's a tricky subject, education.
Absolutely. Let's see. Somebody has said in chat, covering neurodiversity as a whole reminds me of the 80-20 rule. If we can change 20%, that can have the 80% impact. Small changes can make a big difference. That
absolutely.
is absolutely a really good comment to close it on.
A lot of the work that we all do, we will probably all say this, what's good for a neurodiverse team in the workplace is good for everybody. I've worked with organizations where we've helped them change their interview questions from, tell me about yourself to tell me 3 key skills you have that apply to this job. And one firm said to me, actually, that's a better question for everyone. So yeah, I think some of this practice is good, inclusive practice for all.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning, Daniel. Really enjoyed your presentation, and thank you for taking some questions. We are now going to take a slightly longer than 5. It's going to be 7-minute comfort break, and we will be back at 10:05 with our next speakers. So grab a cup of tea, take a break, and we will be back at 10:05. And Daniel, thank you again so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.